Sunday mornings in Redemption Gulch were sacred, carved in dust and silence, where the desert heat hadn't yet burned through the wood of the chapel pews. The town moved slow, reverent, as boots clicked against weathered boards and Bibles were tucked under arms like armor. It was in this hush that Clara Munro appeared. She walked up the church steps alone, head high but shoulders tight, the hem of her worn dress brushing against her ankles. The murmurs began before her hand touched the door. Then came the spit, sharp and deliberate, landing just inches from her boot. A boy no older than 10, pushed by his mother's glare, had done the deed. Another woman scoffed. A man turned his back. Clara didn't flinch. She had faced worse than saliva. She paused, wiped the mark from the porch with her skirt, and turned away. Again. This was the third Sunday she'd tried, and the third time Redemption Gulch reminded her forgiveness might be preached, but it wasn't practiced here. If this beginning gripped your heart, make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Clara Munro had once been the shame of Dead Man's Hollow, a name whispered in saloons and brothels across counties, but she had left that behind. She had scrubbed floors until her knuckles cracked, sewn dresses for pennies, and refused the touch of any man offering coin or favor. Now she lived in a one-room shack just past Widow's Hill, and each Sunday she wrapped herself in hope and tried again. But Redemption Gulch remembered. They remembered the stories, true or not, and chose not to forget. In a town that named its children after saints and nailed scripture to its fences, Clara was a blemish they wanted gone. Yet she returned. That morning, as she walked back down the steps, head bowed but spirit unbroken, a horse trotted past. The rider, tall and dark-coated, slowed as he noticed the gathering crowd and the lone woman stepping away from the house of God. He didn't speak, not yet. He simply watched. The doors of the chapel creaked open behind Clara, hymns echoing faintly. She didn't turn. She walked past the hitching posts, past the staring eyes, and vanished into the rising heat. Inside, the sermon was beginning. Outside, Clara walked into the wind, letting it sting her cheeks until she could no longer taste the shame in her mouth. By the time the congregation said Amen, she had already reached home. And the man on the horse, the new pastor they would later learn, still sat silent in the saddle, watching where she'd gone, his hand resting over the ring on his finger, as if weighing something heavier than gold. Clara Munro had not always been a woman seeking grace. There was a time when her name filled men's mouths with hunger, and women's with contempt. She had been the flame in Dead Man's Hollow, a place not known for mercy or morals. Sold at 15 by a drunk and dying father, Clara was branded early, not with iron, but with whispers and rough hands. Her life in the brothel began with sobs and ended in silence. She learned quickly that survival meant obedience, and that softness had no place in rooms where curtains stayed drawn even in daylight. Madame Letty, who ran the place with a painted smile and cold eyes, taught her the trade. "Don't dream, girl," Letty once told her. "Dreams'll kill you faster than men will." For years, Clara forgot how to dream. Then one night, a girl younger than she had once been came through the doors trembling and bruised. Something broke open in Clara. She stood up, struck a man who reached for the girl, and paid the price in blood and broken ribs. But it was also the night she ran, barefoot, breathless, and bleeding, through canyons and shadows, until Dead Man's Hollow became a smudge in the distance. She wandered for weeks, surviving on scraps and strangers' pity. Eventually she found Redemption Gulch, a town that smelled of sun-dried wood and sanctimony. She chose it for the name, believing in signs. She stayed on the edge of town, out of sight. She took in sewing, cleaned the schoolhouse when no one watched, mended boots for the old and forgotten. Slowly, she carved out a space, thread by thread, but the town saw through her efforts. To them she would always be what she had been. "That woman," they whispered, "that kind." And so, each Sunday, she tested them. She walked to the church, not to provoke, but to pray. She needed no pew, just a chance to sit, to listen, to believe she could be part of something good. But Redemption Gulch did not open its arms. The last time she tried, someone left a piece of broken glass on the church step. She stepped on it, bled through her shoe all the way home. Still, she came again, because somewhere deep inside, beneath the years of survival, there was a piece of her that still believed she could be more. Then she heard the name, Pastor Jonathan Everly, a new man. A preacher who'd lost something too. They said he was different, that he didn't preach fire and damnation but spoke of love, loss, and mercy. Clara didn't hope easily, but when the wind carried whispers of this new shepherd, her fingers trembled slightly as she stitched another seam, because maybe, just maybe, someone would finally look at her and not see the past. The first thing the townsfolk noticed was the way he rode. Straight-backed, slow, like a man not in a hurry to impress. His coat was dark, clean but travel-worn, and the Bible at his side looked older than he did. They called him Pastor Jonathan Everly, though no one in Redemption Gulch knew where he came from, only that the last preacher had taken sick and died with a warning on his lips. Beware of pride in the pulpit. Jonathan arrived on a Thursday. By Friday morning he'd visited the blacksmith, the schoolmistress, and the grocer, asking about the town's needs, not its sins. He didn't speak much of hell. He asked more about widows and orphans. The ring on his hand glinted in the sun, a simple band worn smooth. People noticed he never took it off. They assumed, correctly, that he was a widower, though no one dared ask more. When Sunday came, the church filled not with reverence but curiosity. He stood before them, tall, with deep-set eyes and a voice made for quiet. His sermon didn't thunder. It flowed. He spoke of the Good Samaritan, of mercy over ritual, of hearts turned outward rather than upward. He said, "If our faith builds walls instead of bridges, we are worshipping our image, not our God." The room held its breath. No one had ever heard preaching like that in Redemption Gulch. Outside, Clara sat beneath the cottonwood tree beside the church, the one patch of shade that didn't judge her. She couldn't bring herself to climb the steps again, but she listened. Every word reached her ears like water through dry roots. When the service ended, Jonathan didn't shake hands at the door. Instead, he walked out alone, eyes scanning, until he saw her. She didn't rise. He didn't approach. Their eyes met. For a breath, no more. Then he nodded, just once, and turned away. On Tuesday, he came to her doorstep. Clara answered with caution in her gaze and a needle still in her hand. She'd been mending a jacket. The look on her face said she wasn't expecting company, especially not a pastor. He asked if she would speak with him. She hesitated, but something in his voice, calm, unhurried, free of pity, broke through her guard. She stepped aside. He sat on the wooden stool, didn't comment on the bare walls or the single loaf of bread. Instead, he asked her to tell him her story, if she wanted to. She didn't tell all, just enough for silence to fall between them like dust. Then he spoke. "I don't believe people are broken beyond repair," he said. "Only buried too deep for others to see." She said nothing. But when he left, she watched him go longer than she meant to. That night, she didn't dream, but she did sit awake, wondering what kind of man listens without flinching. The second Sunday after his arrival, Pastor Everly stood at the pulpit as the wooden walls of the church groaned under the breath of another dry morning. The congregation watched him closely now, less out of curiosity and more out of caution. A few elders sat rigid in the front pews, waiting to see if this man would follow the line they'd drawn over years of tradition. Jonathan opened his Bible slowly, then looked out across the rows of familiar faces. He began with a verse about love, not the comforting kind, but the kind that costs something. Then his voice settled into something deeper. He spoke of the woman at the well, of how Jesus didn't condemn her, though she carried the weight of 5 broken promises and a 6th half-love. He told the story not as a distant parable, but as if she was someone they all might know. "Mercy," he said, "isn't given because it's deserved. It's given because it's needed." A hush fell over the church. Even the children stilled. Then he asked a question that cracked the air like a whip. "Who have we turned away from these doors, and what did it cost their soul?" Whispers broke out. A man in the back cleared his throat too loudly. The eldest woman in town, Mrs. Carraway, narrowed her eyes. She had led the ladies' prayer circle for 3 decades and had no interest in being questioned. Jonathan didn't flinch. "The church," he said, "is not a courtroom. It is a hospital. And if we are unwilling to treat the wounded, we have become nothing but walls and windows." Clara, seated beneath her familiar tree outside, felt her breath catch. She hadn't meant to listen again, but his words found her. Again. This time, she stood, walked a little closer. Inside, the sermon finished with quiet conviction. No raised voice, no theatrics, just truth delivered plainly, like bread. After the final hymn, Jonathan stepped down and didn't wait for approval. He left the church through the side door and walked the dirt path toward Clara's modest cabin. She saw him approach and opened the door before he knocked. "I have no tea," she said simply. "I didn't come for tea," he replied. He stepped inside and saw the sewing laid out on the table. A child's torn shirt, a patched sleeve. Redemption, one stitch at a time. They talked not of theology but of sorrow. She told him about the glass on the church step. He told her about the wife he buried under an oak tree in Georgia, the one who taught him that grace had hands and feet, not just words. When he left, he didn't preach or promise, but he said this: "If you come next Sunday, you'll have a place." She didn't answer. Yet the next morning she laid out her cleanest dress. The following week began with whispers, soft at first like wind through the churchyard grass. But by Wednesday they gathered like a storm behind doors and over fences. Redemption Gulch was a town that fed on reputation, and Clara Munro's name was bitter on its tongue. "She's got him fooled," said Mrs. Carraway, pouring sugar into her tea with too much force. "Or worse, he knows exactly who she is and doesn't care." At the general store, two men talked over sacks of grain. "No man visits a woman like that unless he's after something," one muttered. "Pastor or not," the other replied. "Ain't no smoke without fire." By Thursday, the church elders called a meeting. 6 men, weathered by sun and age, sat around a table in the back of the sanctuary, Bible verses clutched like weapons. They didn't mention Clara by name. They didn't have to. "She is a stain," one said, fingers drumming the wood. "Her kind doesn't belong in our pews," another nodded. "And if he won't correct course, we may need to find someone who will." Jonathan sat across from them, unmoved. He listened, let them finish. Then he spoke. "I came here to serve God, not your comfort. If you believe a soul cannot change, then you believe in a weaker gospel than the one I preach." The room fell still. "She's not even asking for your approval," he continued. "Just a seat, just silence instead of shame." One of the older elders stood, voice tight. "We've held this town together through discipline, through tradition. Then maybe it's time we try holding it together through compassion." No one replied. But when Jonathan left the meeting, he knew the battle lines had been drawn. That Sunday, Clara didn't appear. She stayed home folding linens and fighting the weight in her chest. Part of her feared what might happen if she went, but another part feared what it meant if she didn't. Jonathan preached anyway. His sermon touched no names, pointed no fingers, but every word carried the echo of someone unwelcome at the door. After the service, a few families left quickly. Others lingered, silent but watching. That afternoon, Clara found a note tucked beneath her door. Just 5 words, handwritten in firm strokes. "Your story isn't over yet." She didn't need a signature. In town, rumors grew teeth. Some said the pastor had lost his mind. Others hinted at scandal. But the truth was simpler. A man saw a soul where others saw sin and refused to turn his eyes. In Redemption Gulch, that was the greater offense. But still, she folded the note gently and placed it in the Bible she hadn't dared open in years. Because someone believed her story still had pages left. Clara hadn't expected the silence to feel this loud. After the pastor's visit, after the note, the weight of inaction pressed against her chest like the desert sun against tin. Each morning she watched the dust curl outside her window and wondered if the town would ever stop seeing her shadow before her face. She tried to bury the idea of returning, told herself it would only bring more trouble, for her, for him, and yet when she closed her eyes, she saw the quiet fire in Jonathan's eyes, heard his voice steady as stone beneath the weight of judgment. She remembered what it was like to be looked at without being appraised. Still, her hands trembled more often now, not with fear, but with doubt. Redemption was easier to chase than to believe. That evening, just as the sky cracked into violet and the town lit its lamps, she heard footsteps on the gravel. Not hurried, not ashamed, familiar. Jonathan stood there again, hat in hand. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "You are," she replied, voice firm. He almost turned. "But that doesn't mean you have to leave." He stepped inside, and for a moment the room felt warmer than it had in weeks. She asked no questions. Neither did he. Instead, they spoke of things lost. He told her about his wife, Emily, who had loved violets and played the fiddle on quiet nights. Her illness came quickly, the death quicker. He hadn't touched his wedding ring since the day she passed, not out of grief but reverence. Clara listened, chin resting on her palm. His pain was not loud, but it ran deep. She shared fragments in return. The girl she once helped escape, the long nights afterward, hiding in barns and under bridges, How some men only saw debt when they looked at her. "How do you bear their eyes?" she asked him, quieter now. "I don't," he said. "I bear God's instead." She turned her face, not wanting to let the tears show. He waited, as always, without pressure, then stood. "Come this Sunday," he said softly. "Not for them, not for me, but for yourself." Clara hesitated. "If I go," she whispered, "you'll pay for it." "I already have," he answered. "I just haven't decided if the cost was worth it." His words stayed behind long after he left. All night, she sat awake at her table, hands resting on the unfinished hem of a dress she hadn't dared to wear in years. It wasn't fine, but it was clean, honest. When morning came, she walked outside, feeling the dry wind cut across her cheek. For the first time in years, she didn't flinch. Because someone had reached for her without asking for anything in return, and maybe, just maybe, she was ready to reach back. The morning air was brittle with tension, brittle like a pane of glass waiting to crack under pressure. Church bells rang low and slow, echoing across Redemption Gulch, as if even they hesitated to summon what might unfold. Clara stood at the edge of the churchyard, heart pounding like war drums beneath her ribs. Her dress clung gently to her frame, faded, mended, but proud. She took a breath, then another, before placing her foot on the first step. Gasps scattered like gunshots through the congregation still outside. "She's really coming in. The nerve. Where's the pastor? He'll stop her." But Clara kept walking. Inside, the pews were full. Families turned their heads. Children stared. Mothers pulled them close. The rustling died into thick silence as her presence settled like dust on polished wood. She reached the back pew, stood beside it. No one offered space. A man stood. Jonathan. He looked not surprised, not shaken, only steady. He stepped down from the pulpit, walked the aisle slowly, each footfall deliberate as if measuring something sacred. When he reached Clara, he didn't speak to her at first. He turned to the congregation. "Brothers, sisters," he began, "today we are visited not by shame, but by courage." A low murmur rippled across the rows. He raised a hand, silencing it. "I have watched this woman face what most of us never will. Rejection, scorn, and silence, and still she comes, not to be praised, but to be allowed." A voice called from the front, sharp and bitter. "She has no place here." Jonathan looked toward the man. "Then I ask you, what is this place for?" No answer came. Jonathan turned back to Clara. Then, without a word, he pulled his wedding ring from his finger. The breath of the room vanished. He held it between them, palm open, voice clear. "This ring once bound me to a woman who taught me what love truly means. Not comfort, not convenience, but sacrifice. She is gone, but what she gave me I now give forward." He placed the ring in Clara's hand. "Not as a token of ownership," he said, "but as a sign that no soul is beyond restoration, that you are not hidden, you are seen." Clara stared at it, trembling. She didn't cry, not yet. He turned again to the church. "If this house bars the broken, then it bars me too." The silence thickened. A few stood, walked out. Others sat stunned. Some wept. But Clara, she sat down, not at the back, but at the pastor's side. And for the first time she did not sit alone. Outside, the wind picked up dust and scattered it into gold, and somewhere in the heavens a woman named Emily might have smiled. The week that followed shook Redemption Gulch like thunder rolling through canyon walls. By Monday, the town was divided not just in opinion, but in purpose. Half saw the pastor's act as divine courage. The other half called it disgrace. "He defiled the pulpit," said Elder Winthrop, his voice sharp in the town hall. "And for what? A fallen woman with soft eyes?" Others nodded, stirred by fear masquerading as righteousness. The elders wasted no time. By Wednesday, they delivered an ultimatum: resign or be removed. The decision was unanimous, or so they claimed. Jonathan read the letter in silence, folded it once, twice, then set it aflame in his hearth without a word. The next Sunday, the church doors creaked open again, but this time it was Jonathan who stood outside, while a younger preacher, hastily summoned from the next town over, spoke cold words from the pulpit. The pews were full but emptier in spirit. A chill hung over the hymns, and no one looked each other in the eye. Clara did not attend that service. Instead, she stood beside Jonathan beneath the cottonwood tree, a Bible cradled in her hands and the wind lifting the hem of her dress. Around them gathered a quiet group, the overlooked, the judged, the forgotten. There was Mr. Griggs, the former drunk whose son wouldn't speak his name. Widow Lacey, who'd once been accused of witchery for growing herbs. 2 miners with missing limbs. A schoolteacher forced out for loving the wrong man. They came not for sermons, but for sanctuary. Jonathan opened his Bible. Not on a pulpit, but a stump. Not under a roof, but the open sky. And he preached. Of the lost coin. Of the shepherd who left the 99. Of the God who saw what others threw away and called it treasure. No one interrupted. No one walked out. They called it the Chapel of Mercy, a place where the altar was earth and the walls were made of flesh and forgiveness. The town tried to ignore them at first, then they tried to shame them, but the ones who gathered in the dust didn't flinch, because once you've been spit on at the door of a church, there's nothing left to fear. And Clara, she stood beside Jonathan every week, not as his project nor his burden, but as his partner in grace. She didn't need the ring he gave her to prove her worth, but she wore it around her neck, close to her skin, as a reminder, not of shame, but of rescue, of what it meant when one hand reached out and refused to let go. And in time, more footsteps came, quiet ones, heavy ones, desperate ones, because word had spread. There was a place just outside Redemption Gulch where sinners were welcome, and love didn't ask for credentials. The days that followed brought more dust, more whispers, but also more footsteps toward the tree. Redemption Gulch watched from a distance as something impossible unfolded. Not rebellion, not resistance, but quiet, growing peace. The Chapel of Mercy never had doors, but it had open arms, and it grew not through proclamation but through invitation, one soul at a time. A boy who hadn't spoken since his mother died sat beneath Clara's sewing table as she mended his torn vest. A woman who once sold perfume in another town brought wildflowers to place beside the makeshift altar. A former lawman with shaking hands asked Jonathan if he could help dig a well. No one was turned away. Clara rose each day before dawn, collecting herbs from the hills and water from the creek. She baked bread with steady hands, her scars no longer hidden, but no longer shamed. She had grown into something more than redeemed. She had become needed. Jonathan watched her move among the people, speaking low, listening long, and as the community blossomed, so did something deeper between them, something that neither asked for, but neither denied. It was not loud, it did not declare itself, but it was there, in the way he reached for her basket when it was heavy, in how she touched his shoulder when his words faltered, in how they prayed not to be seen, but to be useful. One evening, as the sun folded itself into the horizon, Jonathan took her hand. "I don't want to replace what was," he said, "but I'd like to build something new." Clara didn't speak right away. Instead, she pressed her fingers around his and nodded, a promise not of ownership but of presence. Their wedding was quiet, no silk, no choir, just the tree, the people, and the wind. She wore a plain white dress. He wore the same dark coat. The only ring exchanged was the one once given, now returned not as a relic but as a covenant. And the congregation, the broken, the bruised, the outcast, wept with joy, because love had come not to the perfect, but to the willing. Weeks turned into months. The small flock became a refuge for travelers, the sick, the lonely. Word spread beyond the valley. A pastor and a woman with a past had made a place where shame was not the gatekeeper. And when newcomers arrived, unsure, afraid, it was Clara who stepped forward first. "Welcome," she would say. "There's room." The people of Redemption Gulch kept their distance. Some softened, others hardened. But the chapel didn't need their blessing. It had already been blessed, not by stone or stained glass, but by the kind of grace that grows wild in the places nobody thinks to look. And in the center of it stood Clara, no longer trying to be someone else, only someone whole. Years passed like wind-carving stone, slowly but surely. The people of Redemption Gulch aged, their stories bending with time, but the name Clara Monroe never again carried a whisper of disgrace. It carried weight, kindness, legacy. The Chapel of Mercy stood, weathered but firm, beneath the same cottonwood tree. It had grown, not in size, but in spirit. Where once stood broken souls, now stood leaders, families, children born into belonging instead of judgment. Clara moved through town with ease. Shopkeepers greeted her by name. Children ran to her skirts with stories and laughter. No one spat. No one turned away. Not anymore. Jonathan's hair had silvered. His voice softened with years, but his presence remained steady. The kind of man who bent but never broke. And beside him, always, Clara. Not as the saved, but as the strong. On the anniversary of their wedding, she sat beneath the tree, pen in hand, writing by lamplight. To the woman who cannot enter the church, to the girl standing at the edge of town, to the mother who believes her story has already ended, let me tell you mine. She wrote it not for praise, not for publication, but because some truths had to be shared, because someone once looked her in the eyes and saw more than a mistake, and that changed everything. That letter would be passed hand to hand, copied and folded into other women's pockets, carried across valleys and towns like scripture, not because she was perfect, but because she'd been forgiven. One afternoon, a stranger arrived in Redemption Gulch. Dusty boots, eyes full of hurt. He asked no questions, only stood at the edge of the Chapel of Mercy and watched. Clara noticed him. She walked over and said, "There's water out back and bread inside. You don't have to speak, but you're welcome to stay." He nodded, slowly, as if unsure he'd heard right. She smiled. "You're not the first." And inside, the candles flickered. Jonathan's voice lifted in gentle prayer, and a story that began with shame continued in grace. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and never miss another tale of hope and redemption. Now click the next video on your screen for another unforgettable journey, because every soul has a chapter waiting to be rewritten, even yours.